Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm Marzia Hashmi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, the official version about some ghosts, Osama bin Laden in some cave on the other side of the world defeating our entire military establishment on U.S. soil is absolutely preposterous. Now, these are the words of Philip Marshall, who was a former American pilot and a writer about 9/11, who wrote about the hidden hands in the American government, who he said was behind the Twin Towers attack. And now the question is asked, are there hidden government hands behind Marshall's death, as he and his two children have been found dead on February the 6th, 2013.
Relatives and friends stunned by a violent...
An American news channel reporting a deadly shooting in the U.S. state of California. The incident has left 3 people dead. A man, so the story goes, first kills his 2 children, a teenage boy and a teenage girl, as well as the family dog, and then turns the gun on himself. But the shooting is not similar to the sort of gun violence taking place in the U.S. on an almost daily basis. The man has been identified as Philip Marshall, a 54-year-old former airliner pilot who authored 2 books on the 9/11 attacks, which he declared was an inside job. This fact has given the crime story a political hue, and it's raised serious doubts as to the cause of the deaths.
The police, the local sheriff's department, quickly concluded that Phil Marshall shot his 2 children, his dog, and then himself. However, the investigation had not been fully completed when they made that determination, and then the sheriff allowed the crime scene to be cleaned by professional cleaning personnel. So there has been a real problem in lost evidence, lost clues, and the right now there's a demand for either the Attorney General of the state of California, Kamala Harris, to launch her own investigation of Marshall's death, or the U.S. Attorney General, Eric Holder, ordering the FBI in to conduct an independent investigation. That is the only thing that can be done now, although critical evidence has been lost, unfortunately.
In his books, the veteran aviation pilot accused the administration of former U.S. President George W. Bush of orchestrating the 9/11 attacks. Marshall said,
"The true reason the attack was successful is because of an inside military stand-down and a coordinated training operation that prepared the hijackers to fly heavy commercial airliners. We have dozens of FBI documents to prove that this flight training was conducted in California, Florida and Arizona in the 18 months leading up to the attack."
Philip Marshall wrote in a statement last year,
"Think about this. The official version about some ghost in some cave on the other side of the world defeating our entire military establishment on U.S. soil is absolutely preposterous."
Marshall's death is not the only suspicious death with regards to the September 11 attacks. Many more people, including witnesses to the incident, have lost their lives in recent years. The cause of many of the deaths has been declared to be suicide. The official inquiry into 9/11 blamed several members of Al-Qaeda. Armed with box cutters, they'd allegedly hijacked passenger planes and flown them into the New York Twin Towers, killing thousands of people. But many Americans have still not accepted that story. The U.S. unleashed a devastating war on Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11. The stated aim, dismantling Al-Qaeda and killing or capturing its then leader Osama bin Laden. Many believe the war on Afghanistan was a front for invading Iraq, the country which sits on the 2nd largest oil reserves in the whole world.
Well, I'd like to welcome both my guests to the program. Out of Wisconsin, a member of the scientific panel for the investigation of 9/11, Mr. Kevin Barrett. And out of Berkeley, California, investigative journalist, Mr. Lee Kaplan. Thank you both for being with us right here on the debate. Well, let me start this off in Wisconsin with Mr. Barrett. Well, let's start from the beginning. Do you think that Marshall was murdered?
Well, when I heard about this, I was actually attending the Hollywoodism conference in Tehran, and it did sound very suspicious. Philip Marshall had written a book called The Big Bamboozle, which outlines a lot of interesting information about 9/11. I don't necessarily agree with all of his conclusions about the details of 9/11, but he certainly was casting severe doubt on certain aspects of the official story, and that did make his book somewhat dangerous. But I think more importantly, he had said to his friends and associates before he was killed that he was sitting on a bombshell, some kind of information that was going to change everything, and he was going to be publishing this in his next book. And so that may have been a mistake to talk about that. When I heard about it, I was very suspicious and did a little investigating and heard that there were some discrepancies. But it wasn't until I interviewed former National Security Agency officer Wayne Madsen, who is currently, I call him the thinking man's Seymour Hersh, that is our leading investigative journalist for leaks from the national security community. And when Wayne told me about his week-long investigation, during which he flew out from the East Coast, spent a whole week at the crime scene investigating, talking to neighbors, he discovered that there were all kinds of obvious indications that this had been a professional killing, not a murder-suicide. And those include the fact that Philip Marshall, we now know, he was shot in the left temple, and yet he was right-handed. The police said that his house was far from neighbors' houses, so none of the neighbors would have heard any gunshots. In fact, the neighbors' houses are right on top of his house, virtually, and none of the neighbors heard gunshots. There was a door that was left wide open, a door that Philip Marshall never used. It was found wide open after his death. And there are a number of other indications, including the cleanup of the crime scene, an illegal and unauthorized cleanup of the crime scene by an SUV with state of California plates bristling with communications antenna from the top. So when we put all of this together, I think it's pretty obvious that using Occam's razor, the simplest explanation here is that this was some kind of black operations hit to prevent Philip Marshall from making public some kind of explosive information.
Okay, what about that, Mr. Kaplan? Do you find his death suspicious at all?
No, I don't. If we're going to use Occam's razor as a frame for this event, the Calaveras County Sheriff did investigate this. They're professionals, and they determined that the man killed his children and the dog and committed suicide, and this was due to the fact that he was estranged from his wife, who was away in Turkey. There were apparently text mails that his daughter had sent to friends, in which she was so frustrated with her father that she had wished that the family cat's claws could be shoved into his face. The fact is that he was distraught over the fact his wife was leaving him. He had actually filed a burglary complaint against his wife for going into the family home in 2008. She subsequently had to file charges against him for assault at one point. And the man knew that his marriage was ending. He didn't want to give up custody of the children, and he committed suicide.
Well, Mr. Kaplan, why do you think that why do you think that the crime scene itself was
ridiculous?
Was cleaned up so rapidly?
Well, well, let me give you something to say about Mr. Jarrett. Mr. Barrett. Mr. Barrett is a conspiracy theorist. He writes for Veterans Today. We're on Iranian TV here. The Velati Faqih regime.
That's the biggest veterans publication in America.
Now, you're interrupting me. I'm trying to talk here. You'll have your turn. The point I'm trying to make here is the Velati Faqih regime, if they can tie anything against the U.S. government with a dispute over atomic weapons, if they can tie anything against the Saudis, who I'm no fan of the Saudis.
Well, I'm just asking your opinion, Mr. Kaplan, as an investigative journalist. I'm just asking your opinion. Why would the crime scene be cleaned up so rapidly when the investigation was not complete?
We don't know that the crime scene was cleaned up so rapidly. From what I've read from the Calaveras County Sheriff, they did an investigation. They described the scene. Now, you can go to Mr. Barrett's websites and to Veterans Today, and you can see all kinds of conspiracies that the Israelis and the Jews are behind it, which is typical Iranian fare. You can also understand that I was reading on one of those websites, for example, that the gun was found underneath the body. You're well, I'm getting to that. On your website, there was a statement that the gun was found underneath Philip Marshall's body. And the fact is, we don't know that that's what occurred. He just made a statement that he was shot in the left temple when he used his right hand. Whatever he says in the interview here isn't necessarily true. And based on what I've seen from the Calaveras County Sheriff, and that's the official government body that was there, they ruled this as a killing and a suicide.
Okay.
For a man whose wife was leaving him.
All right. What about that, Mr. Barrett?
And frankly, I believe that's what was true.
All right, Mr. Barrett, how likely is that to be a case, that it's simply a case of some domestic dispute and that the man decided to kill his children and himself because of a breakup?
Well, this is pretty hilarious. I don't know where you got this guy, but this is about the lamest excuse for an attempt to debunk a conspiracy story that I've ever heard, and I've heard a lot of them. I've heard a lot of really bad ones, but this is the worst. This is quite hilarious. This guy has absolutely no grasp of any of the evidence around the Philip Marshall killing, so he starts claiming that I have a website that has information about conspiracies, and he uses this pejorative term conspiracy theorist to try to say that don't listen to what I say. This has nothing to do with the actual evidence of the event that we're talking about, and the reason that he's distracting you and trying to divert your attention away from this case is because that he knows he doesn't have a case. Everything he said about Philip Marshall, you could say probably about 2/3 of the men in America right now. They have the teenage daughter is mad at him once, and of course that's preserved by our ubiquitous internet. He's having a problem with his wife. He's in a divorce case.
Well,
half of American marriages end in divorce.
Let me get back to the main point of this. I want to look at some of the things that Marshall was saying, because he was in the editing phase of his latest book, and he had said that he was somewhat worried about his safety because some of the allegations accuse the former administration, former U.S. President George W. Bush, of working together with Saudi intelligence to carry out the 9/11 attacks. I want to look at that aspect of what was said. Kevin Barrett, what do you think of that actual allegation that Washington and Riyadh colluded on the 9/11 attacks?
Well, Riyadh has been a puppet of what we might call the Zio-American empire, for lack of a better term. The real power structure in the world, the most powerful power structure in the world, is the Federal Reserve and the military forces it controls, including the U.S. military. And Saudi Arabia, ever since it signed an agreement with President Roosevelt in 1945, has been essentially allowing U.S. leaders, which means international banker leaders, to dictate our policy, to dictate oil prices. So it's true that whatever kind of black operations get okayed by the top of the power pyramid here in the U.S. Are going to be obeyed and participated in by the Saudis. I mean, the Saudis can't even fly their own planes, for goodness sake. The U.S. sells them warplanes, and the U.S. has to supply pilots and maintenance people to run the planes. The Saudis are a pathetic puppet state. So accusing the Saudis of involvement, sure they were involved, but the real power behind 9/11 was the neoconservative circles here in the U.S., which is made up of people who are fanatical partisans of the Likudnik vision of Greater Israel. And Philip Marshall, he spoke out about this.
Here we go.
In part, I think the reason that he was killed was that he was a drug pilot. He worked with Barry Seal, the notorious CIA drug smuggling pilot who confessed to having smuggled drugs for the CIA, confessed to having worked with Oliver North on that operation, flying drugs through Mena, Arkansas. And having done that, having that kind of background, having participated with the CIA organized crime nexus based in New Orleans, which he wrote about in his first novel, I think it was Lakeshore, about the airport in New Orleans where the cocaine was coming in, somebody who's that tied into black operations is not somebody that they're going to allow to run around revealing destabilizing secrets.
Okay,
so maybe they were just angry at him for his 9/11 work.